What's cooking, everybody? Dave Altizer here with Kinotika. Today we're comparing the cameras of the DJI Mavic 2 Pro and the DJI Mavic 2 Zoom. This video is only comparing the cameras of both of these drones. If you want to see a full review, then check out the video review that we did in the icon above or the description below. These two drones are very similar in overall performance, but when it comes to the cameras, they couldn't be any more different. In this comparison, we're comparing both photo and video, but still leaning a little bit more heavy on the video side. For the 4K mode on the Pro, we did shoot in the 10-bit color space. Obviously, the Zoom doesn't have that, so you can see a clear comparison between the 10-bit and the 8-bit. The Zoom, of course, has the zoom capability, but we did not feature that in this review. We locked it at 28mm to match the focal length of the Pro to just make it an equal and fair comparison. To make the shots as similar as possible, we used a tripod to keep both of them locked in the same position. Other than one shot, I believe everything was on a tripod. By the way, before we get started, if you want to look at all the things that I'm looking at in their full native resolution, we've included a download link to a Dropbox file that you can download all the footage and all the photos that we took on this comparison. I loaded everything into Final Cut to look at the video comparison, so let's jump into it. So this first comparison, I wanted to max out the bit rate of the 4K on the Pro and the Zoom, so I shot at the highest possible setting we could in log on both the Pro and the Zoom. This shot here was shot on the Mavic 2 Pro at 4K, 24 frames per second, 10-bit in D-Log. I've also applied a little bit of a color grade here, as you can see when I turn it on and off, to kind of level out the image. This is what it's going to look like once you grade it, and like I said, you can turn it off here and see what that looks like without it. The next shot here, again, was shot on the Zoom at its maximum format, 4K at 24 frames per second. In the D-Cine-like mode, there is no D-Log, it's D-Cine-like. And again, I applied a slight grade to that as well. There is no sharpening done in post here. I turned the sharpening off on the cameras, so we should be seeing just straight out of the camera that maximum quality that we can get. So first off here, straight off the bat, the M2 Pro looks nice and crispy, really sharp. You can see a lot of detail in the water here, in the grass. You can actually even see a lot of things in this tree here. If I zoom into 100%, again, you can see just a ton of detail everywhere. It's all over the place here. It does look a little kind of post sharpened. I would maybe soften that in post a bit, but overall, the image is good. I'm not really seeing any moire in the water. And if I turn off the color grade, you can see the difference there in the overall dynamic range, especially out here in the mountains. Everything is looking nice and sharp. There is some chromatic aberration going on in the leaves in the tree here, which is something to just be aware of. That tree was fairly close, and I was focused to infinity at f2.8, so if you stop down, maybe that would solve that chromatic aberration. Here is the Mavic 2 Zoom shot at 4K in the D-Cine-like mode. I will go ahead and zoom in all the way to 100%, and already you can see quite a loss in sharpness on the tree. I will go back and forth here quickly so that you can see the difference. And look at that, all those little cracks in the tree and stuff kind of blur together. It's not terrible, but you can definitely see quite a difference between the two. If I zoom in to 200% and look at those birds back there, they just look really soft. If I go to the next shot here, look in that same area, again, it's actually not super sharp on the Pro, but it's definitely sharper than the Zoom. If I zoom out and just look at the overall image, it does look good. It's definitely not bad. If I turn on and off the color grade, you can see all that dynamic range in the image. Let's zoom in and look at those leaves and see if we get any chromatic aberrations. It's actually a little bit more controlled. Well, not so much. Look at that tree right there. That tree right there is very close to the sensor So that's going to cause that aberration. So we do have aberration on both of these with the lens. So overall, the M2 Pro does beat the Zoom. Obviously, with the 10-bit color space, you have way more dynamic range, and it's a larger sensor, so you're getting a lot more light. It's a little bit sharper as well. Let's move on to another test. Same exact test for the most part, just another angle. This one is actually flying over a little buoy that we found so that we could make sure that the shot was lined up. As you can see here, we've got great rich colors in the Pro. We're shooting at 4K 24 10-bit in the D-Log. If I turn on and off that color grade, once it's color graded and add that saturation, there's just so much depth to the color here. If I skip over to the Zoom, there's a lot of kind of just mushy colors in the background if you compare the two, and that's really where that 10-bit color space is coming into play, and it's really one of the reasons why you should get this drone if you're a professional. But again, when you're shooting super wide like this, it's not really that noticeable at the end of the day. There is some moire going on in the water. I can see here on the Zoom, if I zoom into like 200%, look at that. You can actually see little patterns of pink and green and kind of just little patterns in the water. And that is caused by the moire. If you look at the Pro, it's not there at all. So that's a pretty big difference going between those two shots. Just looking at that moire, you can see the green and pink kind of image artifacts. Let's zoom into this tree here. I'll go between the Pro and the Zoom. So here is this little baby Christmas tree here. I've just chose this to look at. It's a little soft on the Pro, but I can still see in the background here this little trash can and these rocks back here. But if I zoom in to the Zoom, how does it resolve all that detail? So the tree is, of course, visible and the little trash can is there. But these rocks that I saw in the background are totally gone. And again, that just proves that the Pro is capturing a lot more detail. If you see this right here, again, there's all the grass. Look how rich the colors are. Even the dynamic range going from the shadows of the tree here to the green sunlit grass. Compare that to the Zoom. And it's just kind of mushy and desaturated. If I pumped up the saturation a bit in post, maybe that would help. Let me just pump that up to a little bit more. But yeah, I mean, you're getting a lot of image issues with a lot of noise in this. And it's really strange to me how the original Mavic was with noise, and I'm seeing the same thing here with the Zoom. Even at low ISOs, I'm still getting a lot of noise. That's without the color grade, that's with it. And when I zoom out to fit this Zoom image on my screen, on my laptop, it looks great, and I would never see all those image issues. It's when I zoomed in and looked at things at 200% that I really saw it. But you do definitely feel it when you look at the difference between the Pro and the Zoom. Just look at the water, the detail in the water here. Both of those tests were shot in a log format. These next couple of tests were shot without any color profile at all. It was turned off completely. I wanted to see how the image was straight out of the drone as DJI would recommend at the none picture profile. This here again is very similar to the first shot, except we don't have the log profile on the Mavic 2 Pro here at 10-bit color space. There's no color correction on here at all. I would probably add a little bit more magenta to this image. The drone chose to be a little bit more green than I would prefer. And here is the Zoom. As you can see, the Pro really has way more saturation in the no picture profile mode than the Zoom does. That's really curious to me because you would think that with everything turned off that it would have a little bit more punch, but with the Zoom here, it looks very desaturated. Let's just look at the sharpness. I'm going to zoom into this little rock here. I'll zoom into 100%. I now do see quite a bit of moire in the lake area here. It's kind of strange that it's there with no picture profile on the Pro. But yeah, like here is the same shot at log, and there's no moire really to be seen. And then with the picture profile turned off, there is some moire. So that's interesting for sure. Let's zoom into the rock here and look at that on the Zoom. Yeah, so we're looking at this little rock here, looking at the detail. You can see a lot more of the detail here, but it does look quite over sharpened on the Pro. On the zoom, it's still looking, you know, a little soft here, but overall, it doesn't look bad. The only thing I would change about the zoom when you turn the picture profile off is maybe boost your saturation a little bit because it looks a little desaturated. So this next review is comparing the 2.7K mode, which I think is a happy medium between 4K and 1080. It's obviously larger than 1080, but it's smaller than 4K, so it might handle better on your computer if you have a slower computer. So here is the Mavic 2 Pro at 2.7K at 24 frames per second, no picture profile. Again, it looks very similar to the previous shot, except there is no crop now. The Mavic 2 Pro crops in slightly when you're shooting 4K at 10-bit. I'll do a quick A/B here. As you can see the difference on the Pro, I didn't change anything at all between these shots other than the resolution. So if you need a wider angle, consider shooting at 2.7K instead of 4K. You'll get less of a crop. Let's zoom in to 150%. And look at the background. Again, the trees are looking good. The detail in this little tree trunk is looking good. It's a little bit less than the 4K as it should. Here's the difference between the 4K. Look at that tree trunk and then the 2.7K here. You're losing quite a bit of resolution. But the image is still looking good. It's a wider angle, so it might be a better option for you. Let's look at the 2.7K on the zoom. Again, no picture profile, and again, very desaturated. Not a huge difference between 4K and 2.7K on the zoom, actually. If I zoom into 150% and look at the tree here, look at that tree trunk there, and then look at it here. So that is 2.7K, and that is 4K. 4K and 2.7K. I don't know about you, but I can actually not see a difference at all between 4K and 2.7K in terms of just resolution. Let me pick another object to look at. Again, this is 4K. I'm just verifying 4K 24, Mavic 2 zoom. I'm going to look at this rock. So that's 4K, 2.7K. 4K, 2.7. Okay, I can see in the sand and dirt here that it's a little bit softer than the 4K for sure. Look at the detail in the rocks on the bottom there, and then the detail in the rocks there. So yes, there is a slight loss in resolution, but it's not that different. Not as different as the Pro. Let's look at that same shot again out on the water. This is shooting at 60 frames per second, this time in a log format at 2.7K. Like I said earlier, I think this is a great happy medium between 4K and 1080, especially because you can actually shoot at 60 frames per second in 2.7K. So if you're happy with that and you're only delivering in a 1080p export, then 2.7K is a great place to shoot because you can shoot at 60 frames. So here is 60 frames per second, 2.7K at log. I'll zoom into that famous tree in the background that we love so much. There is the tree. It's definitely quite softer than I remember from the 4K. Let's zoom into 2.7K on the zoom. And curious enough, it's looking a little bit more similar. It's not as rich in the colors. Look at all those shadows here and all that noise going on in the image, in the shadows. It's just kind of messy and noisy, and the Pro is just nice and clean and crisp. So the Pro is definitely performing better at 2.7K. Let's zoom out and just hit spacebar on this and look at the footage overall. The water is shimmering in the light and it looks nice. We're getting that same moire from before in the water on the zoom. So again, the Pro is performing much better at 2.7K. This is in a log format with and without, and then with and without. The log on the zoom is quite bad. Once you pull it back, you get a lot of noise in the image. So yeah, the Pro again beats the zoom in terms of overall image quality, but an interesting comparison, especially between the zooms 4K and 2.7K, they're pretty negligible in terms of the difference. So 1080p is obviously possible on these drones. It's something that a lot of people don't talk about because, of course, the shiny 10-bit 4K or 2.7K at 60 frames per second is the fancy pants thing to do. But the 1080p mode on both of these cameras are pretty good, and if you're only delivering in 1080, and especially if you're just delivering online, it's a really great way to save storage on your computer. It's a really great way to edit because your computer will definitely be able to handle 1080p versus 4K at 10-bit. So with this test, we're comparing both just a standard 24 frames per second 1080p mode and the ultimate 120 frames per second slow-mo mode on both of these cameras. So here we have 1080p at 24 frames per second, no picture profile on the Mavic 2 Pro. And like you can see, there is no crop here. Again, this is shot exactly the same as all the other tests. It's on a tripod. All I did is change the resolution, so it's identical. This shot here on my computer looks great. Let's zoom in to 150% and see where it falls apart. Looking at this tree trunk here for that detail, it's definitely softened up quite a bit, but it's still sharp and it retains a lot of the detail still there. If you look at the background with this guy with the dog walking here, if my computer can handle it, everything's looking pretty good. And if I zoom out to fit the whole thing in the image looks nice and crispy, really sharp. And especially if you're on an iPhone looking at this footage, you're not going to really tell a huge difference between 1080p and 4K. It's really when you zoom in and look at things and adjust things in post that you're going to see a huge difference there. But right now, straight off my computer, the 1080p mode at 24 frames per second looks pretty good. The same is true here with the zoom. Let's look at 1080p, 24 frames per second. I'm going to zoom in to 150%. Again, a lot of the same kind of image issues that I've seen earlier, soft, noisy, but not much different than the 2.7K mode, which was not much different than the 4K mode. So if you're not needing 4K, I would highly recommend shooting at 1080p on both of these drones because it's just going to make your life way easier. Now let's move on to the fluid, epic 120 frame per second mode. Let's look at it. On the Mavic 2 Pro, we have it at 1080p. We also have it on the Mavic 2 Zoom at 1080p, but there is a difference. On the Mavic 2 Pro, there is a crop similar to the 4K crop. On the Zoom, there is no crop, which is very strange because there actually is a crop at 60 frames per second on the Zoom, but not at 120, and the reverse is true on the Pro. With all that being said, though, let's look at the exact same location taken on both of these cameras. As you can see here, we have the Mavic 2 Pro at 1080p, 120 frames per second. In D-Log, I'll go ahead and turn off the grade so you can see what that looks like on and off there. But here you go, let's hit spacebar, and as you can see, the water is moving nice and slow, very fluid, very nice, but we're not seeing as much detail as we saw previously on this camera. If you zoom into 150%, you can really see the amount of detail loss in the trash can and the tree. If you remember from earlier, you could see the rocks back here in the background, and now they've kind of gone away, similar to how the Zoom looked originally. But there is just this overall richness in the color. There's a lot less noise in the image than what I'm used to seeing, even at higher resolutions from the Zoom. So you are still getting a better 120 mode here, but there is quite a bit of moire going on here in the water. If I hit spacebar, you can really see the patterns kind of going crazy here in the water in particular. There's also quite a bit of noise in the shadows here, but let's just move on to the Zoom. And like I said earlier, there isn't a crop in 120 mode on the Zoom, but there is on the Pro. If I go back and forth, you can see how much of a difference that is by looking at the edges here. Right here is where the edge stops on the Pro, and then obviously now we're getting way more in the image here on the Zoom. So again, just going back and forth there, exact same location. But let's zoom into 150% on the Zoom and see how that looks. And as you can see, man, it really looks like this image has gone through some significant like noise processing or something. There's almost no detail in any of these trees at all. They're just kind of blobs of trees. And if you go between the two, you can see how much more detail there are in the leaves and the shadows and then the trees on the Pro. and then on the zoom it's just a big blurry mess. Of course, when you're zoomed all the way out, and if you're looking at on a phone, for example, you're not going to see a lot of those issues. It's a nice soft image, I guess, overall. In fact, I'm seeing a little bit less moire than I'm used to seeing here, but maybe it's just this particular shot. I'll zoom into 150 again and look at the water. And yeah, I mean, overall, it's just kind of, it looks like the drone is softening everything, maybe to hide some of the issues. There's some noise in the shadows and stuff. Let's move on to another shot here. This was not shot in log. This is just straight out of the camera. Very sharp, maybe a little overly sharp if I were to be a little picky. If you look at the water, again, we're getting a lot of moire in the image here on the Mavic 2 Pro. I mean, look at that. There's like almost, it's like, doesn't even look like water. It just looks like little bits of information from a computer or something. And if you look out here at these rocks and the details here, let's even look at the pebbles in the beach. A lot of moire, a lot of issues here, but it still kind of has a sharpness to the image. Let's move on to the zoom and compare those two. Obviously our exposure is different. The sun was out during the Pro and the sun was not out. But just look at the detail in the rocks and how much of that goes away on the zoom. Just kind of blurs it all completely together. But there isn't as much moire going on here as the Pro, curiously enough. Maybe that's just because the zoom is blurring everything. I wanted to show you guys what that crop was in the 60 frames per second to 120 mode in 1080 on the zoom. So here is 1080p 120, then there is 60. So you can see a slight crop at 60 frames per second on the zoom at 1080. But let's look at the difference in quality. It's quite a huge difference. Are these ducks? Are these chickens? I don't know. They're just kind of blurry animals in the water. And let's go over to 60 frames per second. Boom, now you can see all that detail. You can see that they are geese with their black and white heads sitting there. And if you go to the 120 mode, there's just no detail there whatsoever. So going back and forth at 200%, you can clearly see quite a substantial amount of detail still being retained at 60 frames per second in 1080p. If you're using this zoom, I highly recommend shooting at 60 frames per second at the maximum. If you want slow-mo, if you have to have that 120 mode, it is there. You know, if somebody's jumping off a cliff and you want to get that really nice cinematic look, it is there. It's not going to look the best. The Mavic Pro is definitely better when it comes to slow motion. Next, we're moving on to the depth of field example. Obviously, the Mavic Pro has better depth of field performance because the sensor size is larger at a f2.8 maximum aperture. Here you can see this picture of Connor. He was standing pretty close to the drone, about 3 feet, and I would change focus from the background to the foreground so you can see how quickly the focus is changing. It's not a very good way to judge this, not very scientific, but I wanted to show off the capabilities here with the depth of field, for example, on the Pro. So as you can see, I'm touching the background and touching the foreground. It didn't lock onto Connor in this moment, but now it did. I actually found when I would touch his face that the drone would not focus properly, but when I would touch his t-shirt, it would focus much better because there's way more contrast in that image. He has a blue, red, white shirt from Soda Parlor. Shout out to Soda Parlor. And the camera seemed to focus on things that had higher contrast, which of course makes sense because this is using a contrast detect autofocus system. So if I zoom into 100%, you can see here how the background is in focus. I tap Connor, nothing. I tap his shirt and boom, we're in. So now you can see a nice blurry background here with a sharp foreground. Everything's looking nice. There's no picture profile on this. This is straight out of the camera with nothing turned on, no log, nothing, no color grade. This is at 10-bit at 4K. Really nice overall image, and honestly better than a lot of DSLRs in certain aspects. I mean, we get 4K at 10-bit with a 1-inch sensor, f2.8, really great to have. Reminds me a lot of the RX100, for example, because that uses a similar sensor size and a similar aperture. Moving on to the zoom, I couldn't get the camera to focus properly at 3 feet. I think that he was a little bit too close. The minimum focus distance was just too close. The camera couldn't focus, so I had Connor move back further than he was with the Pro. And even then, I just could not tell if I was actually in focus or not on Connor. I would tap Connor and it would do stuff. As you can see here, the image would kind of pulsate. And let's zoom in to 150%. And as you can see, kind of everything's in focus. And that's really because we have such a smaller sensor size on the Mavic 2 zoom. My glasses are breaking. You're really not seeing a ton of depth of field here, and that really has to do with the smaller sensor size. If you want to have a little bit more depth of field, then I would recommend zooming in all the way to 48 millimeters, and then that'll give you a little bit more depth of field because you can cheat it with this telephoto mode. However, the aperture does go down to 3.8 at 48 millimeters versus 2.8 on 24 millimeters on the zoom here. So it's kind of give and take. You're really not going to have a lot of depth of field at all because the sensor size is so small. But apparently the autofocus is better on the zoom. It's using a combination of phase detect and contrast detect. But honestly, because everything is in focus, we're really not seeing a great example of that. But hey, at least everything's in focus. So that does it for our video comparison of these two cameras. Now let's move on to stills performance. So I just opened Lightroom up and we are going to look at some raw images that I took on both the Pro and the Zoom. Both these cameras are capable of taking raw DNG files, which is great because it's an open standard, both supported on iOS, Android, Mac, Windows, Lightroom, not Lightroom. Here we go. Let's look at this first image here, shot raw. Obviously, he is underexposed and the background is overexposed. This was done on purpose to test the dynamic range of these raw files. First off, I will say it's great to finally have some nice depth of field with the Mavic series. It's one of those things that was there with the Phantom 4 Pro, which is why I always chose that drone over the Mavic. When it came to traveling, of course the Inspire 2 is a fabulous drone, but it's just way overkill for most people. But now we finally have some great depth of field here with the Mavic Pro, and you can clearly see that with this image. I'm going to go ahead and pull the highlights down first and see how that handles, and it handled well. I mean, we got the clouds back there. Let's go ahead and boost our exposure up some. Okay, we're holding some of the shadows there. As you can see, Connor was making quite a goofy face. And I'm going to boost the shadows up a bit just to kind of go a little extreme here with it. Pull my exposure down, boost my shadows. You know, this is definitely to taste. If you're a photographer, excuse me for being extremely a noob here with my HDR kind of style here, but I'm just pushing this image as far as I possibly can. And I will say that there is some noise definitely here, which is where a lot of the shadows were starting out. But again, I'm not really going to be making a photo look like this. If I were to actually edit this, I'd probably do something more like that. And then let's take the exposure brush and paint a little bit onto his face, like so. Looking good. Now let's adjust some colors here, and our saturation, and our white balance we can totally, of course, adjust because this is raw. So there's the original image that we started out with. Then here's kind of a decent image that I would deliver and post on Instagram. So there's plenty of dynamic range there in the shadows, which is great. It also held all the highlights, which is awesome. A lot of those clouds are still there. And if you zoom in, there's a little bit of noise for sure, and some color loss going on with the face here, but it's not too bad. Let's look at another image similar to the other one, except a little bit wider. I'll go ahead and pull my exposure down, boost my shadows, my highlights, maybe tweak that a bit, crank my saturation, do my white balance, and boom. Really nice, really cool image of Connor flexing. We'll zoom in here so you can look at the sharpness. The Mavic 2 Pro has a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, so we're getting a lot of detail. There's a lot of great dynamic range in this image. And if you're a photographer, this is definitely the best portable photography drone available right now. The Phantom 4 Pro, of course, has a similar camera to this, a 1-inch sensor as well. And if you're a photographer, I would definitely lean more towards the Mavic series because this size is very similar to like a 70-200 lens. So if you're only a photographer and you're interested in buying these drones, this one definitely has a better image quality, but there's some tricks up the zoom sleeve that this one doesn't have. I'm I'm going to go ahead and move on to the zoom now and look at those images. Here is a similar image to the previous one from the zoom. Way less depth of field going on, way less blur. I'm going to pull my exposure down, and it looks like the sky was held enough there. I'll boost my shadows up, pull my highlights down, maybe crank my exposure a little bit. Going back and forth here. Add some saturation. Change my white balance a bit, paint a little exposure on his face, and maybe a little bit more blueness. That's a pretty good example of pushing this as far as it can go. Let's zoom in here, and it looks good. It's sharp. It's not too bad. There is some noise definitely going on in the image, but honestly, if you're comparing both of these images, I wouldn't really see a huge difference. The stills are raw, so we're getting a lot of data there on both of these, the zoom and the pro. So let's do a side-by-side of those two images. There's that one with the zoom and this one with the pro. Honestly, hard to compare these two. They're not the best, most flattering images in the whole wide world. But the color on the pro, I guess, looks a little bit more vivid, but that's also just due to my saturation. But yeah, they look similarly sharp, so that's surprising to see. Yeah, let's move on to this wide shot here of Connor giving us the peace sign on the beach. He had a lot of fun with this. As you can see, those clouds are all held there. As soon as I pull the exposure down, they're all there. I'll pull my highlights down, my shadows up all the way. Kind of play with my exposure a bit, paint Connor in a little bit more with the exposure, change my white balance, my tint just a hair, and crank my saturation up, and boom. I mean, that looks pretty epic too. I'm not gonna lie, this image isn't as bad as I thought. It's got some chromatic aberrations going on here around his pants and on these leaves and stuff, but if we're gonna compare again to the Pro, they're pretty comparable. And if you're only taking stills with these drones, you may want to go with the zoom for some of the features that I'm about to list. Number one, you have zoom, so you can actually zoom in and zoom out. That's highly valuable, especially if you're a photographer. The second thing is a mode that we did not have access to and we were not able to do, but it's called a high res mode, which is only available on the Mavic Zoom. The Mavic 2 Pro has 20 megapixels, the Mavic 2 Zoom has 12 megapixels, but what's pretty amazing with this high res mode is so you can get up to 45 megapixels on one image with this setting. Basically, the way this works is the drone zooms into 48 millimeters and takes a series of 9 images and basically moves the gimbal up, down, left, right, and captures 9 images and stitches all those together to create one epic high resolution image. So if you want high res shots, the zoom is actually a better option. Now, of course, we are going to get better noise performance with the Mavic Pro, and that's what we're going to move on to now. This is all hypothetical for us because we don't have a direct example to show you guys. And when you're stitching 9 images together, you are going to have some issues with movement. So if a car is moving from point A to point B and it happens to capture it with the first image and then the last image, that car would be in both images. So it's kind of the same type of situation that you'd have if you're doing a panoramic shot. But even with that high res shot, the Mavic 2 Pro still might be a better option for you if you're a photographer because of the low light performance, which is what we're going to move on to now. We're starting out first with the Mavic 2 Pro at ISO 100, which is where you're probably going to be when you're outside. And it looks, of course, clean, not a huge problem here. Nothing really fancy to see. I will say that blue is rendered quite odd on this sensor, but who cares about that? Nice overall image, some slight noise in the shadows, but you know, nothing new here. So let's move on to ISO 200. And zooming in, you can see not a huge change for sure. Still very good. Good noise performance, a little moire on the couch, but that's just the sensor, not the ISO. Moving on to ISO 400. We're definitely starting to see some noise already here at 400, but it's nothing that a little noise reduction couldn't get rid of. You can see it in the shadows in particular here on the box. Let's move on to ISO 800. and boom, much more noise here. Very noisy noise too, and what I mean by that is it doesn't look like film grain, it looks very digital, which is less desirable than the film grain look. You can see here in the shadows that there is quite a bit of noise. Going to 1600, boom, there you go. Even more, of course, as you would expect. Looking at that box again, let's go between, what's that, 800 right there, 800 and 1600. And we're moving up to 3200, which is higher already than the Mavic 2 Zoom. We're at 3200, quite noisy for sure. And then we're going up to 6400. Gosh, I hope that you're not having to ever do this, because these images are getting very noisy indeed. When I zoom out, things still look noisy. Moving on to the maximum, which we've never been able to do on a Mavic drone before, 12,800, and that is coming from this new sensor, so we get a little bit more light. And as you can see, the image is definitely extremely noisy. Very, very, very noisy indeed. But let's now compare that to the zoom. So here we are at ISO 100 on the Mavic 2 Zoom, and as we should expect, it's fairly clean. I will say, however, I'm used to looking at the Pro, and the Pro was quite a bit sharper. That is due to the megapixel count. We also have a better rendition of the blue color coming off this light here. That's actually how it looks. So we are getting a little bit of a different color scheme here, which is curious. Moving on to ISO 200, I'm looking at the shadows here. It looks pretty clean, not too bad. It's a fairly clean noise, not as noisy as the Mavic 2 Pro at the higher ISOs. It's not colorful noise, looks kind of filmic. Moving on to ISO 400, and again, I'm liking the noise performance. It's more filmic, less colorful. Definitely noisy at 400. Going to 800, and again, it's still keeping that clean noise look, which I'm starting to like, actually way more than the Pro. ISO 1600, very noisy for sure, but again, no noise in the noise. It's a clean film-like kind of noise, which is awesome to see. Losing a lot of detail here. But the noise is definitely there, but it's clean. It doesn't look digital. And then moving on to 3200, which is the maximum on the Mavic 2 Zoom and the Mavic 1 Pro for that matter. As you can see, it's a little underexposed, and it's extremely noisy. But what's really curious about the Mavic 2 Zoom compared to the Pro is the Pro was giving us a much noisier noise with that digital kind of colorization of the noise. And on the Zoom, we have just kind of like a nice film-like kind of noise. So it's probably easier to clean up the Zoom's noise performance compared to the Pro. Overall, because of that 10-bit color and the 1-inch sensor of the Mavic 2 Pro, we're getting much better color reproduction and overall image sharpness. But with the Mavic 2 Zoom, we have such great versatility with that zoom, and surprisingly, I found that I preferred the look of the noise performance on the Zoom compared to the Pro, at least for stills. I think if you have the ability to buy both of these drones, if they both have things that you want, the Zoom has the capability to obviously zoom, which is extremely versatile, and the Pro has such a great overall image quality that it's actually up to that level where you could actually shoot a movie or like a short film using this drone. But if you can only afford one of these two drones, then I would highly recommend doing a pros and cons list of the things that you need in a drone. If you need something that's really versatile that will give you the most options possible, then go with the Zoom. Not only that, but you're gonna save some money by going with the Zoom. But if you're a professional cinematographer or drone operator, and maybe you have an Inspire or a Phantom 4, and you want a backup drone, the Mavic 2 Pro is the perfect B drone to a great A drone. And if you really value image quality overall, anything else, then the Mavic 2 Pro is definitely going to be the one to get, even if it's your A drone. And if you're having a really hard time deciding which one to get, and maybe you, a couple months in, decide that you wanted the other camera instead, DJI now has this great service where you can send in your drone and actually change out the camera and the gimbal completely to either the Pro or the Zoom. So you kind of always have the ability to change it out and not have to spend a ton of money to buy a whole new drone. Once again, if you want to download the official files from this review comparison, we have a link below in the description where you can download all of them. Feel free to color grade the footage and post it online, but we would really appreciate it if you shared a link to our channel. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up. Once again, I'm Dave Altizer. This is Kinetica. See you next time.